Hello friends. Welcome to the Eastern Front channel. Today we will talk with you about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus adjutant, Arno von Lenski, who fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. Fritz gets a reprimand. Specialist Fritz had been waiting impatiently for the beginning of the operation at Charkov. His pen then sent to the waiting homeland brilliant, enthusiastic accounts of the battles, giving a dubious and frightening new impetus. The cruel Russian winter, and the defeats at Moscow and in the Crimea paled into insignificance. Fritz believed that it was especially good to write an article in the Kiev Soldiers newspaper in which he praised Paulus's promotion to general of panzer troops as that of a great commander. His circumspection and unerring leadership had to be thanked for the victory achieved in the first rank. I recalled that we on the army staff had read this article with pleasure and pride. The specialist rose in our esteem, but Reich's propaganda minister Goebbels reacted otherwise. On the day on which this article appeared in the Kiev Soldiers newspaper, this fellow worker in the army headquarters was sitting next to us at supper when he was called to the telephone. He returned with his head hanging down. What had happened? Goebbels had reproached him because he had praised Paulus as a field commander. This attribute only applied to the Führer and Reich's Chancellor of the Great German Reich. Fritz stayed on with the 6th Army for several more months. I never heard of him making another error. Paulus was angry when he heard of this matter. What do these people have to worry about? As if this was the main question. The fact that we have to deal with this mess because the High Command has underestimated the enemy does not interest them. I find it especially remarkable, General, that the failure of the army and army group commanders should be taken into account. General Guderian, for example, was dismissed after the defeat at Moscow and sent home. Victory is the main obligation of the Führer's commanders. My dear Adam, hopefully you will not express such heretical thoughts in Fritz's presence. I would be sorry if you got into trouble. I will be careful, General. Schmidt, the 6th Army's new Chief of Staff at the beginning of May 1942, the headquarters of the 6th Army changed location. Heim, the former Chief of Staff promoted to Major General a few days previously, was released upon request to Field Marshal von Bach's Army Group South. Bach believed that some difficult situations would not have arisen in the spring of 1942 had Heim not pessimistically condemned the enemy breakthrough at Volchansk. Paulus informed me that he was not convinced about this condemnation, but he did nothing to prevent Heim's release. I found this surprising myself. I prized Major General Heim as an able officer. All the section leaders in the army headquarters liked working with him and regretted his departure. Heim took over the 14th Panzer Division. His successor on the staff was Colonel Arthur Schmidt. Was such a change good in the middle of preparations for an attack shortly before the beginning of the summer offensive? Even Paulus was unhappy about it, as was the Quartermaster General responsible for the whole supply situation. Colonel Pampel was replaced by Colonel Fink. Schmidt and Fink had only a short time in which to work with the trains of thought of their predecessors. Schmidt achieved this very quickly. This shopkeeper's son from Hamburg was clever, agile, and of good intellectual ability, with a hardness that frequently turned to stubbornness. He differed from the former Chief of Staff essentially on one point. Heim understood the need to have a good rapport with all the headquarters establishments, never leaving them in the lurch. Schmidt, in contrast, was intolerant and overbearing, cold and inconsiderate. Mostly he pushed his will through, seldom letting another opinion count. Conflict repeatedly arose between him and the heads of departments, especially with the G1, the quartermaster-in-chief, and sometimes also with the chief engineer. This was not helpful in the final preparations for the summer offensive. Several of our staff officers applied for transfers. Paulus was above the antipathy directed against the new Chief of Staff, using every opportunity to smooth the way, but he did not earnestly consider an alteration in the attitude of the Chief of Staff. I was sorry that the well-trained staff officer Schmidt had so little contact within the army. Even his attitude towards Paulus was not what it should have been. Schmidt tried to keep the commander-in-chief on a leading rein. This was also known by the commanding generals, so that Schmidt met with strong reserve. The army needs replacements. The 6th Army had suffered considerable numbers of casualties in the fighting at Charkov. About 20,000 men had been lost, killed or injured. My task was to close the gap by the accelerated bringing forward of reserves. All the divisions had to be brought up to full fighting strength before the imminent summer offensive. Our requisitions went to the regional army commands back home. Only a few days later we were informed that the first troop transport was on its way. Replacements arrived daily at Charkov, where they were assigned to the divisions. The last division to have been raised in France was also among them, as well as the staff of the List Corps under General von Seydlitz-Kurzbach. The divisional commander reported to Paulus at his headquarters in Charkov, the adjutants handing me their lists of officer appointments. Among the divisional commanders were two men well known to our commander-in-chief, Lieutenant General Janek, commander of the 389th Infantry Division, and Lieutenant General von Gablenz, commander of the 384th Infantry Division. Paulus discussed matters with them for a considerable length of time. He was interested in the frontline training status, the battle worthiness and combat experience of the regimental commanders. I was present when Lieutenant General Janek reported. What he had to say was not welcome. His division consisted almost completely of soldiers with no or little experience of the East, and this also applied to the infantry regimental commanders. They were elderly officers who in the past had been employed in reserve roles such as office duty. They had then been sent on a short course at the French training grounds at Mormillon and afterwards appointed as commanders. They are not naturally commanders, as they lack the experience as well as the basic training in the command of troops. Two of them, from what I have seen, are not even physically up to the coming demands, said General Janek. I would be grateful if you could place two battle-experienced battalion commanders at my disposal. The Personnel Office, on the contrary, want me to give reasons for releasing these two regimental commanders. That is not necessary, General, I interposed. We have orders to test all the commanders again before the beginning of the offensive and, where necessary, to make transfers. The change took place next day, both old officers being transferred to the reserve. Could this problem not have been resolved more quickly and simply? It was considerably more difficult to fill gaps during the fighting. This above all applied to the replacement of men who had fallen in battle. The winter and spring battles in the East had demanded a high toll in blood. I think that the Wehrmacht's losses in the winter of 1941 amounted to 500,000 men. The replacement question was already very urgent by the beginning of the 1942 offensive. It was worrying when one looked at the widespread goals that the High Command had in mind. Conference with Hitler in Poltava on the June 1, 1942. There was a big Führer conference at Army Group South headquarters in Poltava. Hitler appeared escorted by Field Marshal Keitel, the chief of the operations section, Lieutenant General Husinger, the Quartermaster General, General Wagner, and several adjutants. Ordered to the conference room were Field Marshal von Bach, commander of Army Group South, Lieutenant General von Grafenberg, later to be Chief of Staff to Army Group of, Colonel General von Kleist, commander of the 1st Panzer Army, Colonel General Ruoff, commander of the 17th Army, Colonel General Freiherr von Wakes, commander of the 2nd Army, General of Panzer Troops Paulus, commander of the 6th Army, General of Panzer Troops von Mackensen, commander of the IIRD Panzer Corps, and from the Luftwaffe, Colonel General von Richthofen, commander of Air Fleet 4. The conference concerned the planned offensive in the southern sector. Hitler showed the attack goals that had been decided at the conference on the April 5th. He was betting with high stakes, and he himself said, if we don't take Makeup and Gressoni, I must put an end to the war. The Red Army was to be bottled up and destroyed in a vast surrounding operation in southern Russia west of the Don. The approaches to the Volga and the Caucasus with its ground oil resources would thus be cut off, and the Soviet Union dealt a heavy blow. Paulus briefed our headquarters on the forthcoming operations on the German side, and our allies, more than 1.5 million soldiers, more than 1,000 tanks, thousands of aircraft and several thousand guns of all calibers would participate. The 6th Army had to take on the flank protection of the tanks attacking towards Stalingrad. Our commander-in-chief was confident. We all went back to work with renewed vigor. Although the previous undertaking, Operation Friederich's Eye, had smoothed out the Izium bulge, some other things still had to be done to arrange a better starting position for the 6th Army. Thus an attack was made on Volchansk on the June 13th as Operation Wilhelm, and another attack was carried out towards Kupiansk on the June 22nd as Operation Friederich's II, in cooperation with the IIRD Panzer Corps, which remained attached to the 6th Army. The tanks raced forward as the infantry and artillery assumed their attack positions. Following a short but massive bombardment from hundreds of guns, our troops advanced in a pincer movement. Within a few days, the encircled units had been defeated and more than 20,000 prisoners marched into the rear area past the German troops in their new attack positions. Major Reichel shot down with the operation plans on the June 19th. I was sitting in the room with Colonel Volter after a busy day. He had already sent off several messages to the Corps for the further direction of the army group. Then the telephone rang. Volter was urgently wanted by the first staff officer. Put him through. I could not make sense of the long conversation, but I noticed Volter's face getting darker. He banged down the telephone angrily. That's all we need. The first staff officer of the 23rd Panzer Division, Major Reichel, has been shot down in a Fisslerstorch. He had with him orders and maps for the first phase of our offensive. I was so perplexed, I could find nothing sensible to say. I had hardly said a few words when Volter hastily interrupted. Major Reichel had wanted to return to this division from a conference at the XXXXTH Panzer Corps in Charkov in a Fisslerstorch. He had yet to arrive when night fell. The senior duty officer then called the Corps staff on the assumption that Reichel had been delayed, but that was not the case. The Panzer Corps immediately conducted a search for the missing officer. Then the news came from a division that the enemy had shot down a Fisslerstorch between the lines that afternoon. Infantry scouts soon found the aircraft about 4 kilometers from their front line. The aircraft had been forced to land by a shot in the fuel tank. The bodies of Major Reichel and the pilot were buried. There was no trace of either orders or maps. This was disastrous, as his papers also contained the orders and tasks for the planned operation for our left-hand neighbors, the 2nd Army and the 4th Panzer Army. Hitler became personally involved. The commanding general of Panzer Troops Stumm, his chief of staff, Colonel Franz, and the commander of the 23rd Panzer Division, Lieutenant General von Boinberg, were stripped of their commands and brought before a court-martial. General Paulus and Field Marshal von Bach immediately interposed for all three, for they had no direct involvement, but this influenced neither Hitler nor Göring, the chairman of the War Council. Stumm was given 5 years and Franz 3 years imprisonment. Only Boinberg was released. The Reichel case was the catalyst for Hitler's subsequent order that in future no commander of a neighboring formation should be informed about their neighbor's orders. This order had to be so strictly adhered to that it made the coordinated direction of an attack very difficult. Colonel of Panzer Troops von Schweppenberg was appointed as the new commander of the XXXXTH Panzer Corps. Even if he had the necessary experience and ability, this change shortly before the beginning of the new offensive was detrimental in other respects. Every new commander needs a certain amount of time until he has the reins firmly in his hands and confidence in the units under his command. Paulus and Bach were even more concerned, as the XXXXTH Panzer Corps was to open the way to the Big Don Bend and prevent the enemy escaping over the river. Both commanders were also uncomfortable with the court-martial sentences as, in their opinion, Reichel had merely behaved carelessly. So the Reichel case and the way it was handled weighed heavily as a handicap to the forthcoming offensive. We discussed it a lot at Army headquarters. Can we pursue our Operation Blue One in the plan form and to the fixed dates? I asked Volter. The Russians are not stupid. They will try everything to ruin it. Of course we will have to deal with unpleasant surprises, but what can we do? We cannot alter the plan, which would mean putting back the operation a few weeks. We are coming to winter and will perhaps experience one even worse than last year before Moscow. These matters must be considered by the Army High Command and the Army groups. A few days later Paulus informed us that the Army group was against any alteration of the plan. In fact, it was demanding that the date of the operation be brought forward. Propaganda Chief Fritz was not idle in this matter. The success of the 6th Army in the battle at Charkov, the elimination of the breaches and the subsequent actions to improve the starting positions dominated the reports in the press and on the radio. The German forces achieved new feats and new victories. The defeats of the winter were over, with the strength of the Red Army coming to an end. Their attacks at Izium and Volchansk were a last effort. They lay under the fire of our glorious weapons and were smashed by our brave soldiers in counterattacks. So proud were we of our successes in these last 3 weeks that most of us artificially exaggerated them, so much so that the reporting went too far. It clearly bore the stamp of the propagandist, contradicting military thoughts and feelings. We now knew well how hard the fighting was and how many losses it was costing our side. With this conclusion, we gave up this unpleasant matter. The propaganda had another side to it. Daily the officers hammered home to the soldiers that becoming prisoners of war meant a shot in the back of the neck, so they were to sell their lives as expensively as possible. This assertion did not lack results. I too essentially believed in it, recalling the sergeant of the 44th Infantry Division who had reported the good handling of German prisoners of war. But who knew on what grounds he was spreading such news? Why should I worry my head about a situation in which I would never find myself? Now the decisive attack was about to begin and we should be concentrating on that. Field Marshal von Bach has to go. The 6th Army was part of Army Group South, which came under the Army High Command. After Hitler had dismissed Field Marshal von Brauchitsch in December 1941, he himself took over the command of the Wehrmacht and also of the army. Among the higher staffs there was a general impression that Hitler treated most generals with a certain mistrust. It was also said that Goebbels, Göring, and Himmler were especially anxious to keep his doubts alive. Certainly Hitler's boundless personal striving for power and his permanent anxiety thrust aside or at least narrowed down any confidence so that he treated the generals of the old school with distrust. That is how Field Marshal von Bach also came under suspicion. If one takes him correctly, he had, like the other generals, given Hitler loyal service. In the Polish campaign he had commanded the Northern Army Group as a colonel general. In the Western campaign 9 months later von Bach had commanded Army Group B, which invaded the neutral countries of Holland and Belgium. After the end of the Western campaign he was promoted to Field Marshal, but his command of the operations of Army Group Center went less smoothly against Russia in 1941. Despite the commitment of the last battalions, he was unable to take Moscow. Then on the December 2, 1941, he declared in an order, "The enemy defense is on the verge of a crisis." In fact, this did not apply to the enemy but to his own attacking armies. When the Red Army went over into a counteroffensive on the December 5, 1941, the German troops suffered extraordinarily high casualties and were driven back several hundred kilometers. Bach had then reported sick. Hitler named Field Marshal von Kruge as commander of Army Group Center. Several weeks later, following Reichenau's death, Bach took over command of Army Group South. It did not go much better for him than it had at Moscow. He was unable to prevent the Soviets making breaches on either side of Izium. His appearance, already sunken since the defeat at Moscow, no longer lit up Hitler's eyes. The experience of the winter of 1941 too enabled the Field Marshal to take a more realistic view of the assessment of the enemy. His evaluations were more cautious. Like Paulus, he was not of the opinion that the Red Army had been beaten, so he reckoned in the spring of 1942 that it would try to recover Charkov any day. The earnest differences of opinion between Bach and Hitler were further complicated by the termination plan for doing away with the summer offensive threatening either side of Charkov. While the Field Marshal wanted to iron out the Izium Bulge in the area southwest of the Donets, Hitler demanded an attack from the north by the 6th Army. While Bach wanted to attack the enemy breaking through northwest of Charkov using the favorable weather, Hitler made the beginning of this attack dependent upon the recapture of the Kerch Peninsula. These differences were also known to our army staff. I heard about them from Volter. An opportunity for getting rid of the out-of-favor Field Marshal soon arose. On the July 7th Army Group South was split into Army Groups A and B. The command of Army Group A was taken by Field Marshal List, that of Army Group B by Colonel General von Wakes. Field Marshal von Bach received no new command and was retired. The summer offensive begins at the end of June 1942. Army Group South, consisting of the 17th Army, the 1st Panzer Army, the 6th Army, the 4th Panzer Army, the 2nd Army, the 2nd Hungarian Army and an Italian corps, was ready to attack along a front of 8,000 kilometers and D-Day was fixed. The Army's headquarters were established in a former students' hostel on the northern edge of Charkov. Paulus wanted to conduct the breach of the Red Army from this handsome building. The Army's Signals Regiment had orders to follow the progress of the XXXXTH Tank Corps. Grouped into Army Group Wakes, the 2nd Army, 4th Panzer Army and the 2nd Hungarian Army went into the attack on Voronezh on the June 18th. The XXXXTH Tank Corps thrusting forward simultaneously. Unexpected and fierce enemy resistance was encountered between Volchansk and Neshigal, where numerous tanks had been dug in to support the bitterly fighting troops. This resistance temporarily delayed the advance of the XXXXTH Tank Corps and gained the enemy several valuable hours, which he used for redeployment. The 6th Army's 1st Infantry Division attacked on the July 1st after a short but heavy artillery preparation, and on the July 3rd the units of the Red Army were evicted from their bitterly defended positions at Oskol. Our divisions thrust eastwards in a forced march of 30 to 40 kilometers per day, but the expected success did not materialize. In the first few days we came to realize that we had been fighting against numerically weak but well-armed rear guards, their determined defense leading to high losses among our forces. Most of the Soviet troops were able to escape from the threatening destruction. Already by the second day of the attack, the 6th Army headquarters had moved up behind the Soviet troops' former positions. Every evening we waited tensely for the Army report, which the IC took from the radio and presented to the Commander-in-Chief. We were not a little astonished when we heard of our great victory. It was later announced that Army Group South had decisively defeated the opposing enemy army. The staff of the 6th Army regarded this opening success in a much more sober manner. Victory would have entailed hundreds of thousands of prisoners on this vast front and a battlefield covered in dead and wounded. The reality was completely different. Only at Oskol were several thousand prisoners of war brought in. As a rule, reports of numbers of prisoners taken from the divisions were not a source of conversation. Only a few Red Army dead and wounded were found on the battlefield. The enemy were also able to take their heavy weapons and vehicles with them. The XXXXTH Panzer Corps was unable to prevent the weakened enemy from retreating along the Don. The enemy had reached the Don near Koratoyak, and 2 days later were west of Novaya Kalitva. They were already east of Canton Moravka. The Corps' 3 divisions were widely spread out from each other, their movement hampered by lack of fuel, so that the enemy was able to escape again and again through the wide gaps and avoid encirclement. After one of the very hot days of summer, I was walking with General Paulus to and fro near the headquarters, enjoying the cool evening air. The Commander-in-Chief began the conversation. "You will have already noticed that the set goal of destroying the enemy has not been achieved. Our attack was just a thrust into empty space. I presume that the most difficult task still lies ahead of us. Also, the XXXXTH Panzer Corps will hardly be in a position to overtake and surround the enemy in the future. That task can only be achieved if the 4th Panzer Army thrusts into the Don Bend and cooperates with the XXXXTH Panzer Corps. But it is still tied up near Voronezh. Despite the most strenuous commitment of Army Group Wakes, it has not yet been able to occupy the rest of the town and disrupt the railway line to Stalingrad. Indeed, the Chief of Staff tells me that Hitler has now decided to draw away the 4th Panzer Army to the southeast. Hopefully he will do this soon. Meanwhile, the Army headquarters were trying to get a quick connection between the infantry divisions and the Tank Corps. The offensive continued without a break. The weakened enemy remained in flight, and not giving them any time to rest was the task that Paulus had given to the Infantry Corps. Army headquarters was frequently moved, following immediately behind the divisions so as to keep up pressure on the speed of attack. The Army's Signals Regiment received orders most days to advance the Army's main signal cables several dozen kilometers to maintain direct contact. There was also radio connection with the XXXXTH Panzer Corps. Paulus drove daily to the divisions, encouraging the troops to force the pace. They had to get the last out of themselves. They were fighting and marching constantly, and their rest periods at night were only short. We had already left the Donets and Oskol behind us. Before us lay the extensive Don steppe. The July sun burned mercilessly out of an azure blue sky on the dust-covered marching columns. There were no proper roads here, no trees or bushes to give shade, no springs to quench the burning thirst. Wherever the eye looked, one saw only steppe grass and wormwood with legions of ground squirrels in between. And yet this landscape, so monotonous, had its charm and attractions. I have seldom experienced such beautiful sunsets as we did here. The whole steppe seemed to glow. The air was filled with aromatic scents, there was life in the tall grass, crickets chirped, mice whistled, birds sang their evening songs. Then the night covered everything in deep silence. Only some rifle shots from the night guards broke the silence. This area was very scantily settled. Villages were almost only to be found in a few stream valleys running from north to south, visible from a distance along low depressions in the ground. They were just about empty. The population had gone off with their herds of cattle as the troops of the Red Army withdrew. The buildings, where they had not been damaged or destroyed by our artillery and our tanks, were in good condition, clean and cared for. We set up our headquarters in such a village on the wide Don steppe. The command section worked in a building complex belonging to the school, whose entrances had been blocked by barricades as usual. This was only a small part of Arno von Lenski's memories. I am waiting for your discussions in the comments. Also, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel. See you all soon for now.